I rapidly move to the next speaker, which is Frans Verstraete, and he is working for the European Commission since 1997. He's in charge of EU regulation, and I think we have the best person to give the last but not least talk of today. Please, Frans, the floor is yours.
Okay, it's a good morning. Well, it's already noon nearly. So I will, as indeed announced by Paola, give a bit of a background of how can we, from a regulatory point of view, deal with combined exposure to chemicals at the EU level. I want also to already clearly outline that this presentation has not the intention to be fully comprehensive as regards the regulatory approach at the EU level, as regards all combined exposure to chemicals. I will focus on the area where I'm normally working with is indeed on contaminants. And indeed, also besides that, I will also, besides saying, okay, what we are doing as regulating on as regards combined exposure, I also will indeed highlight the many challenges. Well, we have already seen a lot of challenges in regards risk assessment, as regards also the exposure assessment, occurrence data, co-occurrence of mycotoxins. But we also have, from a regulatory point of view, important challenges to effectively regulate. And in order to just to see in which context we are regulating also this combined exposure, just highlighted the basic principles of the general food law is that all food safety legislation has to provide a high level of a high level of human health protection. And of course, all food which has to be placed on the market and available for the consumer has to be safe. And of course, from contaminant, also from mycotoxin point of view, the levels have to be kept as low as reasonably achievable. And indeed, in order to achieve that high level, any food safety legislation has to be based upon, has to be following the process of a risk analysis, which means that it has to be based upon a risk assessment, and which is indeed done indeed by an independent, objective, and transparent manner by EFSA. Then the risk management has to take into account, besides the risk assessment, also other factors legitimate to the factor, which means also the feasibility and the enforceability and so on. So yeah, just try to see if this moves. Yeah. So the scientific risk assessment is indeed, well, looking at what is indeed the health-based guidance value, also and mainly looking at the parent compound, sometimes also including the metabolites. I'll come back on that later. Of course, then another point, like also Bruno already explained this morning, on the exposure assessment, when looking at different populations and high-level consumers, and then the risk characterization. What is indeed the risk for humans as regards the current exposure to contaminants? Because we are talking here about indeed contaminants which are already present. We are not about the pre-market organization, and that's the basis for the measures to be taken. So, and then of course, from a regulatory point of view in contaminants, we see what are the foods which are mainly contributing, what is achievable by applying good practices. We look at the current occurrence data, and we are setting the maximum level at the end of the distribution curve, assuming that the majority is achieved. The data reflect the good practices, and of course, the ones with the higher levels do not reflect good practices. But also, besides only setting purely maximum levels, important is also that we make sure that these maximum levels are enforceable. We have to do that through representative sampling, which is a challenge in the case of mycotoxins. But also, as regards analyzes, it does not make sense if we have a regulation on contaminants or combination of contaminants, which can only be analyzed through a very specific method, which can only be which is time consuming, expensive, and so on. So it's important because for a good safety level that we can ensure frequent controls, and therefore we have to have method of analysis which can be applied on a routine basis, provide reliable results within a reasonable time at a reasonable cost. And it's also important that also for the auto controls for food business operators that screening methodologies are available. So this is, and quickly, the context, now coming to the topic, indeed, the combined exposure. And indeed, we have seen already different approaches and so on. And we can see that in current risk assessments, we see that already to a certain extent, the EFSA has already taken into account the combined exposure. And for instance, we have the case of dioxins and dioxin-like PCBs, where indeed we have the combined exposure to 29 compounds, 17 dioxins, 12 dioxin-like PCBs, and based upon the toxicity studies, each compound has given a toxic equivalent factor, which indeed you can then, by summing up, then coming to a toxic equivalent. As regards non-dioxin-like PCBs, where we talk about 197 compounds there, there EFSA has looked upon it and said, okay, there are 6 compounds which are basis of the risk assessment, which composes about 50% of the total, and this was then based upon the risk assessment was based upon. The same for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, where we see that there are 16 different polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and there also, as regards indeed for indeed control, they say, well, you can have a marker substance which is representative for the toxicity and the prevalence of all polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Same for the recent opinion on the perfluorinated alkylated substances, where they have looked, but there they have looked at only 4 substances, PFOA, PFNA, and PFHX. So which is, but out of thousands. So this is only very limited. It's already going towards different ones, but to limit. Also, in pyrrolidine alkaloids, there are many alkaloids. EFSA has indeed looked into the assessment of 28 pyrrolidine alkaloids, but also there, the toxicity was based upon 1 compound, but then extrapolated to all other compounds. With indeed the uncertainty that, of course, not all pyrrolidine alkaloids have the same toxicity, but of course there was no information, no toxicity information on the different toxicity of the different compounds. So from a, I would say, precautionary approach, EFSA assumed that indeed all compounds had the same toxicity. And also for opium alkaloids, we have indeed a sum of 2 compounds, morphine and codeine, but there with a factor of 0.2 to codeine. And for tropane alkaloids, also, in fact, we have the sum of 2 compounds, scopolamine and atropine, but this is also out of many other propane alkaloids. So also there you can see to a certain extent it has been already taken into account, but it has also still limited in certain cases. For aflatoxins, there we have indeed also the addition for aflatoxin compounds, although in fact also in the assessment they are added also for risk management, although we know that the B1 is much more potent than, for instance, the B2, the G1 is more potent than the G2. Also for fumonisins, we have already heard, we see this sum of the 3, but also, well, as indeed also was already referred to in previous, there are also hidden or modified fumonisins which were not yet taken into account into this risk assessment. For deoxynivalenol, we have there also the sum of the parent compound, deoxynivalenol, with some metabolites. And as I said, also for the mycotoxins, we have the issue with indeed the modified forms, and there I come back on that on in the next slides on zearalenone and T2 and HT2 toxin. Also on ergot alkaloids, we have indeed the combination of the addition of 12 compounds, and also for tropane alkaloids, I already mentioned it. So as you can see, indeed, EFSA has already taken into account, I would say, for similar compounds, the combined exposure in the risk assessment. To which extent has that been taken into account in the risk management? Well, in fact, also here you can see we did already in risk management, the regulations do regulate to the sum of the dioxin and dioxin-like PCBs and the total tech value. Also, indeed, for the non-dioxin-like PCBs, it's also to the sum. For the PAHs, we have indeed there also looked upon the maximum levels for the sum of 4. For aflatoxins, also to the sum of 4. For fumonosins, to the sum of 2. In fact, we have not taken into account B3 because it's the least prevalent form, and also from an analytical point of view, there are some challenges. For tropane alkaloids, we have the sum of 2. Also for pyridine alkaloids, we have in the maximum level sum of 21. And the opium alkaloids, also sum of morphine and codeine. And ergot alkaloids, also the sum of 12 ergot alkaloids. So as you can see also in the risk management, we have to a certain extent taken into account the combined exposure. But that's for sure not fully comprehensive, and not indeed, I would say, when we are seeing that the combined exposure, and indeed the initial point that I made that all food has to be safe, we are there still a gap, and mainly a gap of knowledge and feasibility. Because we have not taken into account, while we have in certain cases taken into account the combined exposure from a risk management point of view, we have not taken into account the case of deoxynivalenol. We have still regulations on the parent compound and not on the modified form 3-acetyl, 15-acetyl deoxynivalenol and DON-3-glucoside. In fact, the intention was to have it, but in fact, we had been, as a drawback, first of all, there seemed to be too limited occurrence data, where in the same sample, indeed, all the parent compound and the modified forms were analyzed. And secondly, there is indeed, from an enforcement point of view, seems that indeed the routine methods of analysis do not reliably analyze all modified forms in enough sensitive way. So that is the reason why also now, when we are discussing the setting of reviewing the maximum levels for deoxynivalenol, that we are still looking at the parent compound because we are faced with the drawbacks of mainly of analytical feasibility and also lack of sufficient occurrence data. Also taken into account what has been said through the climate change. We see also a huge year-to-year variation, also geographical variation, and which is indeed, we need sufficient data to be able, when we come to a regulation at EU level, to be able to cover all for these differences. For T2 and HT2 toxin and zearalenone, why we have not taken into account, and I will then just go to the next 2 slides. As you see, for zearalenone, there are many compounds related, and even, as you can see, there have been some shifts in the presentation, that indeed even some of these modified forms are much more toxic than the parent compound. So we have only regulated the parent compound and not yet all the modified forms. And so, in fact, this is indeed, I would say, a gap and a shortage as regards, indeed, is the food safe, because we are only regulating the parent compound. I cannot say that with 100% certainty. Could we regulate also the modified forms, where we see, well, the problem is that, first of all, there are nearly no occurrence data available on these modified forms in food such. And secondly, there is even not a method of analysis available on a routine basis to analyze it. So the problem is that there we see we could, you can always say in legislation, this maximum level includes also all the metabolites and all the modified forms. But if there are no means to control it, and if we do not know to which extent these levels are achievable, we cannot regulate. And so this is indeed a point on which we have to work further in the coming years to be able to indeed also regulate the modified forms so that indeed we can say the food is safe as regards zearalenone and its modified form. The same is applicable for T2 and HD2 toxin, although a bit less, I would say, a bit less imminent in that sense, that because indeed the modified forms, we don't know to which extent they occur in the food, and also they seem to have a less toxicity than the parent compounds T2 and HD2 toxin. So why we have it indeed not regulated, why indeed EFSA has assessed also these modified forms, why did we not regulate it? Mainly because there are no information on occurrence data, and there is no available routine method of analysis to analyze them all in a reliable and in a, say, not too time-consuming way. And so, also in EFSA, as I already said, there are some shortcomings as regards when they look into the combined exposure, because in many cases they do not have compound-specific toxicity data, and so in most cases they have said, well, by indeed in a way of moving forward, we take indeed that all compounds have the same toxicity, taken into account the data we have on the toxicity from certain compounds. That was the case for for tyrosine alkaloids, where indeed we have only information on a few compounds. And also, well, when we can try to see what is the exposure, we have to acknowledge that there is indeed, in many cases, a lack of information on occurrence in food itself. So that has still a lot of uncertainties, and as you have heard, indeed, EFSA is working on it to improve the situation as regards methodologies, as regards also to as data, and hopefully we will be also to regulate it and ensuring a high level of food safety. So, in fact, until now, I have only spoken about the combined exposure to similar compounds. And let's say, dioxins and dioxin-like PCBs, deoxynivalenol and its modified forms. And to a certain extent, this has been taken into account already in the EFSA risk assessment, and also to a certain extent, rather maybe limited extent, also already in the risk management. But of course, a big, larger challenge will be indeed to look into the combined exposure to non-similar compounds. And there also we have seen that in the co-occurrence, when we are looking at the data, also relatively limited, we can see that, for instance, in certain samples of maize, high levels of deoxynivalenol are indeed also have also high levels of fumonisins, and also indeed sometimes high levels of zearalenone. So in the same sample, and of course we have regulated already the parent compound individually for deoxynivalenol, not taken into account the metabolites. We have already regulated individually the presence of zearalenone, not taking into account the metabolites, and we have regulated the presence of fumonisins, not taking into account the hidden forms. So EU legislation provides indeed safe food as regards the individual compounds. We have still to see to which extent it is also protective as regards the modified form. But for sure, we cannot make a firm statement as regards the safety, as regards its combined exposure to the three mycotoxins in this case. So indeed, that is also something which we will have to look into the future, because we have to ensure that food is safe, and if we have the tools to ensure that, we will have to do it. And as I said in the outlook, in order to ensure this high level of human health safety, which is indeed the basis of all food safety legislation, we will have to, from a risk management point of view, in the future, in the field of contaminants, address more combined exposure, not only between similar compounds, but also between non-similar compounds. But we all know there are significant drawbacks and challenges related to that, as well from a risk assessment point of view, as well from a risk management point of view. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Frans. I think it is quite clear also from your presentation how complex is the situation. Apparently, the legislation now is simpler than the complicated picture we showed today, but you very clearly explain why.